series of the greatest sermon ever. And in this particular passage, Jesus deals with three quite important things. The first one he deals with is adultery. Akin to that, he deals with the subject of divorce. And thirdly, he deals with taking oaths. I'm going to deal with the third one first because I need to spend a bit more time on the last two. So, oaths. Oaths has got nothing whatsoever to do with bad language or swearing, but it has to do with promising to do something and some authority as witness and judge if you failed to do it. The passage in Matthew chapter 5 verse 33, again Jesus says, "You have heard that it was said to the people long ago, 'Do not break your oath, but fulfill to the Lord the vows you have made.'" The third commandment, which is repeated in Deuteronomy 5 and Leviticus 19 and Exodus chapter 20, "You shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain, for the Lord will not leave him unpunished who takes his name in vain." In other words, if you're going to call on God as a witness to your promise to do something, you better do it. Put simply, don't commit perjury when you invoke God's name. But the Pharisees, in their usual nitpicking fashion, changed the emphasis from the that is made to the correct form of the oath. We know this because Jesus has a really good go at them later on in Matthew's Gospel. He says in chapter 23, "Woe to you, blind guides! You say, if anyone swears by the temple, it means nothing. But if anyone who swears by the gold of the temple is bound by that oath. You blind fools, which is greater, the gold or the temple that makes the gold sacred," etc., etc., etc. About the only time that we as Christians are required to take an oath is in a court of law, where you put your hand on the Bible or magazine of your choice and swear to tell the truth. And that we have to do, of course, because as Christians we are to be obedient where possible to the civil authorities. Peter reminds us of that. "Submit yourselves for the Lord's sake to every human authority," and so on. People don't use oaths very much today. Sometimes you'll hear someone say, "I'm going to do such and such, may God help me." First reaction to that should be to help him not to get his knickers in a twist, I think. But pausing for a moment, no Christian has the right, in fact nobody has the right to command God to do anything. You're commanding God? Really? And let alone tell him to smite you badly if you break your promise. That's not a part of a Christian worldview at all. And swearing by anything else is kind of preposterous. I've heard people say, "I swear by all that's holy that I'm going to..." All that's holy? What exactly would that be? And what power does it have to hold you to your promise? You might as well say, I swear by my cotton socks, your mighty cotton socks. It doesn't make much sense. And Jesus in verse 33 says, "I tell you, don't swear an oath at all, either by heaven, because it's God's throne, or by earth, for it's his footstool, or by Jerusalem, for it's the city of the great King. And don't swear by your head, for you cannot even make one hair white or black, or keep them in when they're supposed to fall out. And all you need to say simply is yes or no. Anything beyond that comes from the evil one." We Christians should be people of our word. Our yes should be yes, our no should be no, and people should understand that when we say yes or no, we really mean it. further embellishment is really just a piece of theatre. It's not necessary. Now let's turn to the other two matters that Jesus raises here. They're connected by a single concept, which we need to look at first. In Matthew 5:27, Jesus says, "You have heard that it was said, 'You shall not commit adultery.' But I tell you that anyone who looks at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery with her in his heart." You remember right at the beginning of the sermon, Jesus taught that the values of the kingdom of God begin with the attitude of the heart. And later on in Luke's Gospel, Jesus enlarges on that. He says, "A good man brings good things out of the good stored up in his heart. And an evil man brings evil things out of the evil stored up in his heart. For the mouth speaks what the heart is full of." Adultery may begin in the bedroom, may end in the bedroom rather, but it begins in the heart. The heart learns from the eyes. Blokes, I think, are particularly prone to this form of temptation. And every bloke privately knows when look has turned to lust. And I would also suggest that every girl knows the difference between attractive and seductive. But before we look at what Jesus says next on this particular issue, we need to say something about biblical interpretation. In the Bible, we find various literary forms. Historical narrative, poetry, parable would be three of them. And we also find various literary devices, metaphor, simile, or hyperbole, to mention just three. And if you don't recognise them when they are being used, you'll totally miss the meaning of the text. For example, when John the Baptist cries out from the middle of the Jordan River, "Behold the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world," he wasn't pointing to a sheep on the bank. He was using metaphorical language, and he was talking about Jesus, of course. He was using a literary device. Now, in this passage that we're dealing with, Jesus is using another literary device. It goes like this: "If your right eye causes you to stumble, gouge it out and throw it away. It's better for you to lose one part of your body than for your whole body to be thrown into hell. Or if your right hand causes you to stumble, cut it off and throw it away. It's better for you to lose one part of your body than for your whole body to go into hell." Jesus is using hyperbole to make a particular strong point. He's not suggesting self-mutilation. It's a very effective hyperbole. Question: is it worth allowing anything to send you to hell? Answer, capital, bold, italic: no. Nothing is worth that. And that's the point that Jesus is making. And what are we to read? How are we to read that teaching? If you're going to be tempted to sin through your eyes, don't look. Or if your hand is causing you to sin somehow because of something you're doing, stop doing it. Behave as though you were handless and blind and couldn't do it. Let me give you a good example of that kind of thing. A good friend of mine was telling me how proud he was of his two grandsons who were surfing somewhere around here on the northern beaches. And while they were in the water, they noticed that some of the girls around them had started to remove their bikini tops. And the older brother said to the other one, "We're out of here." And they left the water and went to another beach. And that's what Jesus is talking about. In order to appreciate what Jesus is saying about adultery, we have to focus first on what Jesus says concerning marriage. In our second reading, which details an incident where Jesus is touching on exactly the same topic, the Pharisees ask Jesus a question. They asked, "Is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for any and every reason?" Now that was a loaded question. They didn't really want an answer. They wanted to embroil Jesus in a dispute. That question is based on a misquote of Deuteronomy chapter 24, which goes like this. It starts with if. It's a conditional clause. If a man marries a woman who becomes displeasing to him because he's indecent about her, and he writes her a certificate of divorce, gives it to her and sends it from his house, and several other conditional clauses follow. See, there was a dispute between two rabbinical schools at what that something indecent actually meant. The school of Rabbi Hillel taught that that could include absolutely anything that the husband didn't like, including the woman's looks. Whereas the school of Rabbi Shammai taught that it only really referred to something quite disgraceful on the level of adultery. As I said, the Pharisees wanted to embroil Jesus in this debate by making him take one side. And Jesus answers by reminding them what marriage actually is. He says in verse 4 of chapter 19, "Haven't you read that at the beginning the Creator made them male and female, and said, for this reason a man will leave his father and mother and be united to his wife, and the two will become one flesh. So they are no longer two, but one flesh. Therefore, what God has joined together, let no one separate." Notice that Jesus says what, not who God has joined together. The focus isn't on the people, it's on God's pattern of marriage. Adam and Eve provide the first examples of this pattern or institution. We're told that Adam and Eve were naked and they felt no shame whatsoever. Each could give their body to the other without hiding anything of who they were. And the nakedness and the total openness of their giving to one another found its highest and most intimate expression in becoming one flesh. And so amazing was this highest and most intimate expression of oneness that through it new human beings could come into existence, ready to be nurtured within the love of their parents. And may I point out right at the beginning here, folks, that this isn't Christian marriage as distinct from Islamic marriage or modern marriage, whatever that is, that it's just a Christian version of it. No. This is marriage as God designed it to be, and it applies to, well, everyone. Is that okay? It isn't just the Christian's take on what marriage is. It's the Creator's take on what marriage is. And once again, Genesis is describing marriage, not just sex. What God has joined together in marriage, let no one separate. It's fairly clear, isn't it? We'd really love to know how Adam and Eve related to one another on a sort of a daily basis in this first perfect example of marriage. But as we know, too quickly the music moves into the minor key, doesn't it? Adam and Eve disobey God. They disobey God. And what's the first expression of their disobedience? They hide from one another. And what exactly do they hide from one another? The very parts of their body that was used to express the oneness and the giving them of themselves completely to one another. That's not an accident. We would long to know more about that first perfect marriage relationship before it went bad. But we've had no example to call on, that is, until Jesus came. And now we have a model for marriage, for a perfect marriage. And Paul talks about it in Ephesians chapter 5, between Jesus, between Christ and his body, the church. That is in Ephesians chapter 5, 21 to 28. Be yourselves self-submitting to one another out of reverence for Christ. That verb's in the middle voice. We haven't got time to delve deeply into that, but I want to make 2 points out of what it says. First of all, marriage is a covenant agreement between a particular man and a particular woman. There's a covenant relationship between us and Jesus, and marriage is a covenantal relationship. And marriage is to be marked, this is a bit of a mouthful, is to be marked by mutual, other person-centered love for one another, which expresses itself in unqualified commitment of one to the other in every circumstance of life. Let me say that again, because that is the attitude. Jesus, what did he spare in order to love us? Nothing. He gave his life on the cross in order to redeem us, to make us a beautiful church, the bride of Christ. Marriage is to be marked by mutual, other person-centered love of one for the other, which expresses itself in unqualified commitment of one to the other in every circumstance of life. Within the security of that covenantal, other person-centered commitment, a husband and wife become one flesh, each giving their bodies completely to the other. And from that highest act of human intimacy may come children who will thrive in that environment of godly love, the environment provided by that home. That's not just the Christian take on it. That's what marriage actually is. Please remember that. Because this Christian understanding of marriage doesn't fit anywhere in our modern sexualized post-truth culture. It's on another planet. It doesn't fit anywhere. In fact, such a model is regarded today as repressive and unwholesome because it causes harm to the freedom of the individual to engage in whatever sexual pleasure they wish whenever they want it. How restrictive. What God has joined together, let no man separate. That couldn't be clearer, could it? Anything that causes the fracture of this marriage relationship is wrong. The Pharisees, who belong mostly to the more liberal Hillel school, got that message too, and they didn't like it one little bit. Hence their question. Why then, they said, did Moses command that a man give his wife a certificate of divorce and send her away? And Jesus gives a very interesting reply. He says, Moses permitted you to divorce your wives. Your hearts were hard. It wasn't this way in the beginning. The Israelites, you recall, spent 400 years in Egypt. Egyptians had a very liberated view of marriage. When a man wanted to be married, he'd go and grab a girl, some of them 13 years old plus, and start living with her. There was no marriage contract at all. If it didn't work out, he could grab another one or tell the first one to go. Or she had rights to do exactly the same thing. And after a little bit of property settlement, it all began again. That was all there was. Too easy. And the pagans through which 40 years of wandering in the wilderness with the pagans that were there was rubbing shoulders with people who had sort of the same view of marriage, although it wasn't nearly as good as from the woman's point of view in many cases. And Moses is faced with a very difficult situation. His people are copying the practices that they'd grown up with. And Moses wisely legislates to regulate that practice because he knew he couldn't prevent it. And this illustrates a very, very important principle. When you can't get something completely right, you have to do as much right as you can because it's the only option available. Does that make sense? When you can't do everything completely right, you have to do as much right as you can because you've got no alternative. Moses knew what was right concerning marriage. Why? Well, because God had told him at Mount Horeb, remember? The fire on the mountain. There's Moses coming down the mountain with the 2 tablets of stone and the 10 commandments. He knew exactly what was right, but he couldn't achieve that amongst his people. He doesn't change the law of God to suit the occasion. There's a different name for doing that. Instead, he rescues as much good as he can out of his people's hardness of heart. Because that's all he can do. He insists that the man write the woman a bill of divorce. And it went like this. Be it known that I have written, whoever, a bill of divorce. By doing so is her departure from us notified to all. She is in her own hand and has power to go and marry any other man whom she pleases. In my name, therefore, let no man hinder her. From this day forward and forever, she is free to any man. That's what the bill was. This bill specifically freed the woman from her marriage contract and declared her free to marry again whom she chose. Without that bill, she would have been an outcast. It's unlikely that her father's home would have accepted her back. She couldn't claim her dowry, and no one would want her as a marriage partner. It would almost force the woman into poverty or prostitution. We live in an imperfect, sinful world, people. And as Christians, we are in the minority. We know what is right and we know what is wrong. Why? Because God has told us. Does this mean we can always do what is right, what we know is right? If you think the answer to that is yes, then you're floating above the earth in a happy cloud somewhere. I can give you another example if you like. What another example then? You do? Okay, all right. 6 things the Lord hates, 7 that are abomination to him. Haughty eyes and a lying tongue. Does God approve of lying? No, of course he doesn't, right? Wrong, it's wrong. It's always wrong to lie, yes? That's true. Right. You are in Turkey. You have half a dozen Christian missionaries who are fleeing from Islam. You're hiding them in your house. The Taliban comes to the door, knocks on it and says, do you have Christian missionaries here? And you say, I can't tell a lie, it's wrong. Yes, I do. And after a prolonged burst of gunfire, they walk away from the dead bodies. Have you done the right thing? Well, tell me. No. Because you couldn't possibly do both. You have an obligation to protect those people, those godly people who have come into your house for protection. And the only way you can do that is by telling a lie. So that's what I'm talking about. There are situations where you get into where you can't do what is completely right. It's just not an option given to you. Is that okay? All right, thank you. Hope so. Talk to me about it afterwards. Sometimes we have to do what Moses did. We have to retrieve as much good out of a situation as possible, simply because doing what is completely right is not an available option. Now, Paul applies that principle in this very same area of marriage, especially when a believer was married to an unbeliever. It's a very common situation in the early years of the church, and it's a common situation. In 1 Corinthians chapter 7, Paul says, if any brother has a wife, and notice Paul's high view of marriage. He's pushing God's view of marriage all the way through. If a brother has a wife who is not a believer, and she is willing to live with him, he must not divorce her. And if the woman has a husband who is not a believer, and he is willing to live with her, she must not divorce him. But if the unbeliever leaves, let it be so. The brother or sister is not bound in such circumstances. That means she's free to marry again. Haven't time to go into the reasons why, but that's what the text says. God has called us to live in peace. And then he gives some encouragement to those who are in that situation. He says, wife, whether you will save your husband. Or how do you know, husband, whether you will save your wife? In other words, living as a Christian next to this person may cause them to see the reality of Jesus and to turn and follow him. If the unbeliever walks out of the marriage, the other partner is free to marry again. If you forbade them to marry strictly according to law, you'll be forcing someone who's had no control over their marriage breakdown to pay the penalty for it. Hence, Paul's what's called a retrieval ethic is what he's doing. When it comes to marriage problems, we are often forced to apply the same practice. We can't just simply turn dispassionately away and insist that the marriage continues regardless of the consequences. No. For example, one partner may be suffering from physical abuse. We can't let that happen. We can't let that continue. And sometimes serious psychological issues surface that make the marriage relationship impossible. A friend of mine been married for 5 years. After that, he's a Christian, she's a Christian. He came to me and he said, we've only consummated marriage 3 times in 5 years. There's something wrong here. And that woman went for counselling, she went for psychiatric, this, that and the other thing, couldn't change her mind, couldn't do anything about that. That marriage broke up. Sometimes there's a psychological condition which prevents the marriage from working. And tragically, sometimes both parties knew that these problems existed before the marriage, but they still went ahead on the basis that romance will all. Let me tell you, it won't. There are many other situations which I could mention. But to reiterate, people, the biblical truth about what marriage is doesn't fit anywhere in our post-truth society. And it's worse than that, because in addition, that same post-truth society often makes a marriage relationship, as it should be, even more difficult to actually achieve. It's impossible to swim in the water without wet. And we Christians unconsciously, or sometimes even consciously, pick up attitudes and habits which work directly against God's pattern of marriage. Our society, unlike any other before it, affirms the importance of the self above all. It attaches enormous authority to the self. And children exposed uncritically to this narcissistic worldview find it very, very hard when they grow up to give themselves completely in service to anyone, let alone their marriage partner. A young person who feels or believes that they have the right to decide for themselves what is right and what is wrong, based mostly on the way they feel, can't conceive of a relationship based on other person-centered love. It's not in their dictionary. All their relationships are what I would call tick and dog relationships. The dog is only there purely to meet the needs of the tick. And all you can hope for is if they ever marry, they will see their marriage partner as the best way to secure their own individual interests. In that case, you've got two ticks and no dog. The consequence of all this is it is not easy to maintain a happy marriage. And many young people, having witnessed the failure of their marriages around them, perhaps their own parents, decide just to live together, hoping that the arguments won't start, and if they do, we can just simply walk away from it. I think that's such a sad picture. But I can tell you this, having witnessed the end of these relationships amongst my own students, I can tell you there's plenty of fuss, and there's plenty of hurt, and there's plenty of anger every single time. My experience, divorce is always accompanied by grief, frustration, deep personal hurt, anger, and damage. And tragically, I found in my own experience that the married couple in trouble decide to seek counselling when it's too darn late, and nothing can be done to rescue the relationship. And I say that with personal sorrow, because there have been times when I've tried to do that with someone I love, and I failed. And for all these reasons, when we're confronted with marriage problems, we must be very, very careful and prayerful to discern how to rescue the greatest amount of good. And that's a lot harder to do than just simply laying down the letter of the law and turning away. God's pattern for marriage is under the greatest threat today that has ever been since I've been alive. And for that reason, we married people should pray for and uphold one another, especially young marrieds among us. and do everything we can to strengthen marriage ties and to do absolutely nothing to weaken them. Let me say this, that God's grace, when met by a willing and a repentant heart, when met by the willingness to forgive, can restore almost anything, even a marriage broken and fractured by adultery. Val and I have seen it happen with our own eyes. 64 years ago, I made a decision which changed the direction of my life. I didn't think it would at the time, but it has. On that occasion, I asked Jesus to be my Lord. 55 years ago, and as a result of that change in direction, I married the most beautiful young woman you could ever imagine. And we've walked hand in hand through those years ever since. It's been a rough road sometimes, and we've seen sad things. Both of us are looking forward to our journey to heaven, but we don't want to end our journey either with each other. I'd like to finish with a plea to those of you who aren't married, to those of you who are. Firstly, to those of you who aren't. As Jesus has been teaching us, choosing the right partner for your marriage is crucially, absolutely crucially important. As Jesus has been teaching us, we need to look at the heart. Your prospective partner might be real eye candy, but very immature in other words. And you need to put down roots into every area of their lives so that you can get to know them properly and allow them to do the same to you. And if you come across nasty surprises in that process, please don't bury them in testosterone and think it will be all right. In particular, if you're a Christian, don't look for a marriage partner among the unbelievers. There's some really lovely unbelievers out there. They're good looking, they're kind, they're everything else, but they don't believe in Jesus. And their life is going in a different direction. You may think that the power of your love will conquer all, but once again I can tell you it won't. Only the Spirit of God gives life. Your love doesn't do that, no matter how great it is. And to those of us who are married, and I include myself, if there's some little thing in your marriage which is causing that ever so small ripple in the smooth ocean of other person's centered love, please attend to it. Talk about it together. Pray together about it. And get back to the place where you can give yourselves completely to one another. Holding nothing back, as Eve did at first, and delight in the gift of marriage that God has given you. Don't ever let your marriage get to the point where someone else has to decide how best to limit the damage. Now, folks, after that, I don't know how you feel, but you may have some questions, some may have received some, or you may want to ask one. Please remember, I'm not a guru. I'm happy to apply the Word of God, but I can't solve every problem, especially while I'm on my feet up here. You may like to talk to me afterwards. If there are no questions, I'll feel better and we'll get on with the show.